Kwinganawaloma, ni Dishinzi, Sheshko Halawas Dion, non Giai Nahi, Walk Toronto, ni Dilana Pewe, Potwatome, Niha Nish Minito, Anashik. Welcome, everybody. It's really great to see you all here. I introduced myself in one of my ancestral languages. I was speaking Lenape. I'm a Lenape language learner. It's really important to be able to put those words out into the universe. Both of my mother's parents attended residential schools. So I was talking to somebody recently who said to me, asked about language, and I said, it's interesting because one of the common questions when you tell people that you're Indigenous, they ask, oh, do you speak your language? And when you say no, they go, oh, you lost your language. And it's important for me to clarify, we didn't lose it, right? To say we lost it makes me feel like, we carelessly dropped it on our way to something important. That's not what happened. Our languages were taken from us through the residential school system. So to stand here today and welcome you all to this panel, honoring the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation here at York University, it's especially important to me to be able to say those words and, as I said, put the words into the universe so that our ancestors know that in spite of all that has happened, we are taking back the right to know our languages, to know the knowledge embedded in our languages. So, like I said, thank you very much for being here, for participating in this event. And I would like to invite my colleague, Marian McGregor, Director of the Center for Human Rights, Equity and Inclusion, to come up and do the land acknowledgement for us.
Thank you, Susan. York University recognizes that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of the university. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. The territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peacefully share and care for the Great Lake regions. As has become tradition, once delivering a land acknowledgement, at least I try and do at least a moment of reflection. And today is an acknowledgement of the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. It's all about a reflection. And in my reflection, I want to thank Susan in her role as the AVP Indigenous for the curated film series put together. It was a very wonderful way to engage in that reflection and to help me in that way, and I want to take up that opportunity to do it. And my reflection about that is, for me, is trying not to turn away. The stories were very difficult to hear, they were very emotional, and my reflection is to look, to watch, to bear witness, and to take action after. Thank you.
Anashik Chimagwech. Yes, so this is our third year of acknowledging the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, and we have a wonderful panel of speakers that we're going to hear from. But first now I would like to call up my friend, colleague, Alice Pitt, the interim Vice President, Equity, People, and Culture, for some opening remarks. Alice.
Thank you, Susan. It's so lovely to be able to work with Susan again after many years, and thank you, Marion. Welcome to all of you. It's so great to see so many people I have known for a really long time, and also so many people that I've just recently met in this new role and undertaking this new work. It's really lovely to see you. I'm also very proud to be representing the university today, as our president, who would dearly love to have been here, is out of the country and unable to join us. So as we know, we're observing the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. It's normally observed on September 20th, September 30th of every year, but we didn't think it was going to be fair to call you out on September 30th. It falls on a Saturday. The creation of a National Day was called for 8 years ago by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada in its final report and 94 calls to action. It took 5 years for the National Day to come into existence. Maybe we can think of each one of those years as standing for 100 years. The orange shirts that many of us wear became a symbol of awareness about the impacts of Canada's residential school system 10 years ago in 2013, and it was inspired by the story of Phyllis Webstad, who had proudly worn the orange shirt her grandmother gave her to wear on the first day of school. She was stripped of her clothes upon arrival, including her new orange shirt, which was never returned to her. She was 6 years old. This experience left her feeling sad and alone, and we can imagine that we could hear her asking the question, who are these people, and why do they want to hurt me? Later in life, because she, her mother, and grandmother had been forced to attend residential school, she questioned her own capacity to parent. So many of their parenting, grandparenting experiences were marred by residential schooling. This is just one example of the intergenerational effects of the residential schools, and very powerfully depicted in the films that we saw over the last couple of weeks. As the TRC stated, residential schools were created for the purpose of separating Aboriginal children from their families in order to minimize and weaken family ties and cultural linkages, and to indoctrinate children into a new culture. And as Susan so powerfully pointed out, to take language away from people. The TRC's, and this is a quote, focus on truth determination was intended to lay the foundation for the important question of reconciliation. Now that we know about residential schools and their legacies, what do we do about it? This year, the organizing committee felt it important to focus efforts on supporting community members to take action in learning about residential schools and their legacies. They decided to focus on how individuals and groups of people can engage in learning by engaging with various forms of media. The past 10 days have seen a variety of films screened, open to all members of the York community. I think that we will hear more about the impact of some of those films. The university's National Day for Truth and Reconciliation website includes links to many resources, the films themselves, other podcasts, and more to support everyone's learning. And I would like to encourage people to visit the website. It is a really very powerful and lovely website, and a very significant resource for the university. Today, you will hear staff voices share their learning journeys. I commend all the panelists for their leadership in sharing vulnerabilities and what they've learned along the way. These will be difficult stories too, and I'm reminded of the distinction that Freud makes between learning about something and learning from something. And that distinction registers for us the importance of paying attention to our emotions as we are engaging in learning and maybe trying not to learn, and being able to hold on to that. And Marion alluded to that when she was giving when she was giving the land acknowledgement. I think we'll have more of that. Learning about residential schools, the horrors that students were subject to, and their lasting legacies is just the first step. All of us must find ways to reject the colonial, paternalistic, and racist foundations of the residential school system and find new ways to form relationships with Indigenous communities and individuals. We must be committed to rebuilding healthy relationships built on mutual respect. We must be committed to transforming society, including educational establishments, in such a way that we can all live together in dignity, peace, and prosperity, and maybe bring alive that Wampum Belt Covenant. I hope that all of you have come to today's event, whether in person or online, and that was just my first reminder that there are people online. I want to give a shout out to Amy Gockel, who in particular from my office would love to have been here today. I hope that all of you, whether in person or online, have come with open hearts and open minds. I certainly am very much interested in learning from my colleagues today and taking some time to reflect on my own learnings to inform my future actions. Thank you, and I'll give the microphone back to Susan.
Anashik, Alice. Each year we've asked, the first year, our first panel, we drew on the senior leadership team to talk about what this day means to them. And last year, our panel focused on hearing the voices of students. And this year, I'm very happy to say that we have staff here to share what does this day mean to them. So I'm going to introduce the staff members that have agreed to participate and to share their thoughts with us. I'll introduce them all together, and then they will each come up and share their words. So we have Dirk Rodriguez, Director of Student Engagement from the Division of Students. And we have Nancy Gonzalez, Traditional Counselor at the Center for Indigenous Student Services. We have Marilee Molina from Lassonde, and Marilee will be followed by Angie Chifeta, the Executive Assistant at the Center for Human Rights, Equity, and Inclusion. And then we'll have Yvette Monroe, Assistant Vice Provost, Student Success. So we'll start now, and I invite Dirk up to share his thoughts. So they'll be talking about what the day means to them, and maybe also talking about their engagement with media and how that has impacted their learning. So Dirk?
Good morning. I am grateful and humbled by the invitation to be here and share my reflections on this institutional observance of this year's National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. I come to this space as a queer, racialized, neurodivergent, cisgendered settler with ancestors from the southern part of India, having now made my home in Takaranto, the ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations. I have been at York for almost 2.5 years, and I joined in the summer of 2021. As a scholar, I teach and maintain a research agenda about young adults and their experiences of social wellness on campus and in community using the arts. As an artist, I'm a theater geek. Yes, I was a drama kid, and now an applied drama practitioner. And I am a higher education administrator here at York as Director for Student Engagement. My approach to education, be it in the classroom, in the corridor, or in the community, has always been to embrace creativity and artistic expression. For me, the arts, and especially drama, is about sharing an embodied language to talk about, beside, and around shared concerns. It is about mobilizing a form that comes in through the back door or the side door, and not bursting in through the front door with contrived notions of what is often rehearsed neutrality. And then, somehow, during my time here at York, during the thick of the ongoing and overlapping and intersecting multiple pandemics, because we know there ain't just one happening at any one time, I come across the searing words of feminist and literary giant Alice Walker, who said, "We mustn't become a people who cannot feel. We've seen what happens to people who stop feeling." This is a reminder that the body, and by extension, its embodiment, is a site of memory. As Cindy Cruz reminds us, the body prompts memory and language. It builds community and coalition. The body becomes a pedagogical device, a location of recentering and recontextualizing the self and the stories that emanate from that self, end quote. Today, the invitation to this panel encouraged me to speak about how I have engaged with different media, and I include the arts in that, as part of my learning about residential schools. To get there, I want to offer a few thoughts of how I have come to understand what it means for me to engage in decolonial practice. If colonial thinking and practice privileges the mind, then a key principle of decolonial practice as an alternative to majoritarian ideas is to privilege the body. To privilege the body is to see ways of knowing, thinking, being, living, and also imagining as intrinsically connected through the body. As Ruha Benjamin notes in their book, Viral Justice, and I quote, "Bodies tell stories that people will not tell." End quote. Part of such a decolonial shift from mind to body necessitates a consideration of indigeneity. For me, as a queer racialized settler, what does that mean? There is no fixed idea or definition of indigeneity, and it extends beyond reductive notions of just physical existence to include knowledge systems, history, culture, identity, politics, resistance, affect, actively emerging in and through the land. While recognizing the work of scholars such as Deloria, Tuckanyang, Simpson, Coulthard, which center the land in thinking about indigeneity and decolonization, as a queer racialized settler who arrived on this land with a certain degree of socioeconomic privilege, I am drawn to George Day's idea about writing towards this work, which sees indigeneity as an international category and a coordinate. I want to think about this idea because it is a social location from which I can understand indigeneity and my responsibility and the importance of reflection on a day like this. And I understand that my thinking is unique to me and not universally shared by non-Black people of color. What I have found especially helpful in strengthening my commitment to better understand and orient myself to the land and to the histories of Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island, it is also about turning to the land of my ancestors to reckon with my own indigenous epistemes and to make meaning of those knowledges. Sitting with this relationship between what I see as an uppercase I, which is a reference to First Peoples of this land, the original caretakers of this land, and lowercase I, and acknowledges and values specific to my land of ancestry, history, and cultural practice, I've found myself that is especially critical to facilitating my ongoing learning. Ultimately, I see this as an act of my responsibility and a first step for me, and a necessary one. Perhaps if I were to offer further reflection about the arts and media, I will turn to a micro-encounter that occurred the summer I joined York. I was walking back to the Bennett Center with then Vice Provost students Lucy Fromowitz after a summer orientation event. And the federal government had just announced September 30th as the inaugural day for Truth and Reconciliation. And she asked me what I thought the Division of Students should do to mark the event. I didn't have a firm answer for her at the time. But being an artist at heart, I had heard of several groups, and in particular a theater company, Theater Passe Marai, engaging in an ongoing reflective and purposeful reading of the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. A few weeks later, I was invited to be part of a pan-university group that would assemble to mark to decide on what we would do to mark this day, and offered the idea. The idea, as many or even some of you might expect, did not catch on. It did not resonate. And I'm grateful to Professor Dion, and I thank her for this, because she, if you know Professor Dion, in her gentle way, asked the so what and now what question, a classic educator question. And while the scholar, artist, and educator in me, and let's be honest, every ounce of what it means to be a man in this world wanted to kind of justify my idea, wanted me to go on and on and on and on, and how I would scaffold it pedagogically and, make sure that everybody was taken care of, I paused. I hadn't considered what Dr. Dion was saying. I hadn't considered the impact fully. Later, it would be Amy Gockel, Senior Executive Officer, who invited me into a moment of allyship and asked me to reconsider the risk of such an undertaking. Akin to handing out stickers at each Pride Month, ally stickers at each Pride Month, or going dark with our profile pics on social media to mark Black Lives Matter for a hot summer, the idea really ran the risk of being performative, to accommodate the feelings of settlers, but doing nothing to shift the reality of what this day meant, of what it means for Indigenous peoples. So instead, I turned directly to art. I had also heard of Rosanna Deerchild's podcast, This Place, 150 Years Retold, based on the groundbreaking and critically acclaimed graphic novel of the same name. Through dramatizations and interviews, award-winning poet, author, and podcast host Deerchild, who is Cree, guides listeners through the heroes, battles, triumphs, and traditions which live outside and beyond the national imaginary that we have come to know through our schooling system and the curriculum. Over 10 weeks that fall, I engaged over 300 participants from across the university in a lunchtime e-learning series where we moved through one chapter and episode. For the visual, I shared the graphic novel. For the auditory inclined, we collectively listened to the podcast episode. I facilitated a brief discussion thereafter, and participants could attend as many sessions as they could stay as long as they wanted to, as long as their schedules and commitments could let them. Links and materials were shared in advance, and while pre-work was encouraged, it was not required. But the feedback here yielded another learning. What deepens learning through the arts and media is the relational engagement between people that ought to scaffold it. The graphic novel and accompanying podcast attempted to take existing history and to look at it anew, in a different way, in a manner that takes us closer to lived reality. It transports us to stories of Indigenous resistance and resilience across time and place, and compels us to forge a connection with it and with our own lives. It invites us to imagine a different way. And I want to be able to say that this reminds me of another example in a different role of how we can intentionally immerse ourselves in the learning. What can we do to get from our comfortable spaces and lean into that discomfort? My learning has also been deepened through my relationship with art. Growing up Catholic, studying in Jesuit schools, being a survivor of sexual violence, and identifying as queer, there are a lot of complicated feelings that come up when I encounter the history of residential schools. I cannot run away. It is a different kind of secondary traumatic stress that also needs tending. Am I doing my work? And here, art has been a balm. Through Norval Morrisseau, especially his Indian Jesus Christ in 1974, I sit with my complicated relationship with religion and faith, especially when he declared in a documentary, Jesus died for the white man and not for the Indians. Encountering Christy Belcourt's installation of stained glass artwork installed above the west door of Centre Block on Parliament Hill in Ottawa that commemorates the legacy of residential schools in Canada is an invitation to look forward. What does Indigenous futurity look like? And finally, in Kent Monkman, The Scream, a visceral, heart-wrenching, and unflinching reference to the violence of residential schools that is part of their curriculum, part of their exhibition, Shame and Prejudice, a story of resilience. I see an invitation to unlearn, unmake, and question our intergenerational inheritances. I want to leave you with a final thought. The mere consumption of arts and media does not inherently liberate or heal. It does not placate the guilt or shame. Creative work is the doing of that artist and creator. They're doing what they've wanted to do and not what is needed to be done. And let that sit for a moment. The arts and media have not promised transformation. No creative work ever does. But artists offer a different way in, their own way in. I want to be able to kind of end with the arts and media as sites of learning does not necessarily give us more, but they call on us as educators, and yes, we are all educators, to do more, to recognize, to make connections relationally and through that collective learning, and apply that to how we will do our work. Audre Lorde says, "I'm a Black feminist, lesbian, poet, mother doing my work. Are you doing yours?" For artists, the creative is an orientation. It is another way of being and doing, a sensibility. It is framed through the question of what it means to not do the work, but to do my work. And my is important. Given your available resources, how can you not do the work that is clearly yours to do? Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Nancy Gonzalez. I am the traditional counselor at the Center for Indigenous Student Services. And today I've been asked to just share a reflection on my experiences and what today means to me. I want to start off with a song just to kind of set the mood and grounding. Yeah, Maya Quiche. My ancestors are from Mayan, from Guatemala. And Flint Knife, one who seeks justice and truth, Dihash. The song I'm going to share is a woman's honor song. It's a song I shared when I first met Susan Dion. And I think it's appropriate for today. It's an East Coast song. Anageya, wehaweya, wehanawe, wehaweya, wena, weha, ha, 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 wenawe, wenahi, wenawe, wenaha, wena, weya, weya, wehaweya, 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 ha, ha, ha. Anageya, wehaweya, wehanawe, wehaweya, wena, weya, ha, ha, ha. Wenawe, wenahi, wenawe, weya, wena, weya, weya, wehaweya, 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 ha, 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 ha. Anageya, wehaweya, wehanawe, wehaweya, wena, weya, ha, ha, ha. Wenawe, wenahi, wenawe, weya, wena, weya, weya, wehaweya, 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 ha, ha, ha. Anageya, wehaweya, wehanawe, wehaweya, wena, weya, ha, ha, ha. See them dance in grace and beauty, mothers, grandmothers, aunties, sisters, women of the nations, women of all nations. You are the strength, you are the beauty, we are the healing. Ahau, Magdasela. I have the privilege of servicing the children and families of those affected by the Canadian residential school system at KISS, the Centre for Indigenous Student Services. I have held a helper's role within the Southern Ontario Indigenous communities for the past 15 years. I am a support to students' mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual well-being to their journeys as they navigate their institutional educational journey. Maltiosh, thank you to the committee members who organized this event. What does truth and reconciliation mean to me? It means many things to me. I think that as Indigenous people and the conquest was between 200 and 300 years ago. This is why our traditions are still very close beneath our skin and way of life. In Europe, that conquest happened 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. As an Indigenous person, I often get asked to talk about Canada's hidden history, genocide. This is a touchy subject for me, as being a descendant of the Mayan people who experienced genocide in the 80s, and long before that. I think that it is each individual's responsibility to learn Canada's original people's true history. However, I implore you to learn your own familial history. Learning our social location with humility is important. Reconciliation doesn't mean anything unless it's put into action. The original people of this land's voices still do not matter to the government. It's no secret. I recall my work with the friends and relatives of the disappeared from the Canadian residential school system in 2008 and 2009, and are pleased to the Harper government. The Catholic Diocese, Archdiocese, and Anglican and United Church organizations to hand over the names and records of all the children. I recall chanting, "We want to know where those children are buried. They need a proper burial, proper ceremony." All they did was call the police on us. We were all women without any weapons. Their reaction was fear and chaos. Even after the 2 apologies by a federal government, they ignored the community's pleas. I recall the slurs said to us as we stood in the cold with our cloth banners by the staff from the church. I remember thinking, this is how they treat us for having a voice. I cannot imagine how much pain and suffering was instilled by residential school officials to the Indigenous children. Fast forward to 14 years later, and I remember hearing the news that the first mass grave had been identified in the Kamloops. I remember the children each time in ceremony. I carry these baby moccasins with me. It was not 100 years ago that the last residential school closed. It took the Indigenous communities and their rightful sovereignty to find those mass graves. It was not the government. I stand here today because I felt a responsibility as a visitor of this territory to shine some light on Canada's hidden history, genocide, and that the only manner in which Indigenous people can continue to heal and share their traditional ways is through action to sovereignty. Sovereignty to the land, laws, education, health, and medicinal practices. Northern Indigenous people always knew how to take care of the land, and as Indigenous people, we never understood how the land, air, and water could be bought and sold to other humans. Another dark aspect of reconciliation is, please do not invite Indigenous people to provide ceremony last minute. It gives off you are tokenizing vibes. Instead, create a committee early enough where Indigenous people or groups feel that they are part of the planning process, and allow indoor spaces the capacity to turn on and off the smoke alarms to allow for the use of traditional medicines. Take the time to familiarize yourself with what a smudging ceremony represents by inviting an elder to your department for cultural competency training. I want to acknowledge each and every one of you that are here today. I truly hope that we can continue working towards paving the way to greater awareness to how we can increase enrollment and retention for Indigenous students at York. I see it. We have outgrown our KISS office above the York Lanes Mall. Our team has been really busy. I want to recommend a documentary, if you haven't seen it or heard of it, by Kevin Annett, Hidden from History, Canada's Hidden Genocide. And just wanted to share something that I saw. You may have seen it on social media. What they missed out on, the children. Goodnight kisses, morning cuddles, bedtime stories, mommy when they were sick, a kiss on their boo-boo, presents on Christmas Day, no birthdays, swimming on a sunny day, and I love you every day. And last, I wrote a poem. It's called Grateful. I am grateful for the elders that stand up tall. I am grateful for the elders who walk with pride. I am grateful for the elders who share their wisdom. I am grateful to the elders for having my back. I am grateful to the elders for their love. Oh, grandmother and grandfather, your life is worthy and full of grace. You have shared so much kindness with community. You are the centralized nervous system of community. Your teachings are the hearts of gold and are the foundation of our ways of being and knowing. They tried to take your pride away. They tried to strip you of your dignity. They tried to take your medicine away. They tried to steal your bundle of love. What they did not know was that your spirit has always been the bundle. Thank you. Maldios.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Angie Ciuffetta. My pronouns are she, her. I am a white settler with Italian immigrant parents, and I grew up following the Catholic faith. I am honored to be here today. Thank you for allowing me to share my journey in learning about residential schools. I first learned about residential schools from the news as an adult, rather than from history books provided by the Board of Education. I attended a Catholic school where one of the first things I learned through a white settler's reinterpretation of Indigenous history was the significance of the totem poles. As an adult, however, I learned how our education system whitewashed this cultural significance. What I later learned from Indigenous voices was that the Canadian federal government believed totem poles were obstructing its goal to assimilate Indigenous peoples to Eurocentric culture and norms, and created the potlatch law, which removed totem poles and other spiritual artifacts from the land and placed them in museums and collections around the world. The whitewashing, stereotyping, and erasure of Indigenous culture in history books were prevalent in our education system. The way we were taught was as though Indigenous peoples existed in the past, as though Indigenous peoples were no longer in existence. Residential schools were also never taught to us in our classrooms. I give these examples to show that I was not given the truth, There are big parts of Canada's history that I didn't learn, and parts that I did learn from a settler perspective that I needed to unlearn. I think about what it must feel like for an Indigenous child to read the same history books as I did as a child, and having their story written and taught through the colonizer's lens. When the discovery of unmarked graves in former residential schools was brought to light, a lot of questions came up for me. Why didn't I hear about these atrocities sooner? Why did the church and Canadian government fail to prevent these abuses? What purpose did the residential school serve, if anything? I realized I had more questions than answers, and there was a lot more I needed to learn. I decided to learn about Indigenous culture and Canada's true history on my own and with others by listening to stories from Indigenous peoples, reading books written by Indigenous authors, taking courses, and hearing the voices of Indigenous peoples rather than a reinterpretation of that history. My position at the Center for Human Rights, Equity, and Inclusion provided me with further opportunities to learn. I, along with my colleagues, completed a course offered through the University of Alberta entitled Indigenous Canada. I found this course informative, and what was helpful for me was the conversations and discussions that our team would have after each module. We would discuss the module and talk about what stood out to us. Even if I was just learning, it was a helpful conversation to be a part of. I realized that I was not alone in feeling shame and embarrassment for what I did not know, and we were learning together as part of a team. I came across a YouTube channel where professors from the University of Alberta host weekly discussions and Q&As from each module of the Indigenous Canada course. This was a helpful tool in my learning to better understand and dive deeper into the curriculum. One of the conversations was about how Indigenous parents felt having their children being taken from them and sent to residential schools without having a choice. This made me think about the pandemic, when parents expressed outrage and fear about sending their children to school due to the coronavirus. And it made me think about how Indigenous parents felt having their children being taken from them, sent to residential schools, and exposed to many types of diseases, especially tuberculosis, that killed thousands of Indigenous children. Indigenous parents didn't have an option for protest. Indigenous parents were not allowed to have protocols in place to keep their children safe. And Indigenous parents would be sent to jail if they didn't comply with the law. This made me think about the contrast in privilege and how settlers experience privilege differently than Indigenous peoples. What I am learning is that being a good human from an Indigenous worldview comes with obligations, and from a Western worldview, it comes with entitlements. Learning about residential schools opened my eyes to the harsh truths about the atrocities that were committed towards Indigenous children and the cruel policies orchestrated by the Catholic Church and Canadian government. Our department is currently reading Susan Dion's book, Braided Learning, and as a team, we have discussions on each of the chapters. I learned that immediately after the first schools opened, parents and Indigenous leaders brought serious concerns to the government's attention, which were ignored. I learned this history is not long in the past. Memories and experiences live with survivors. After all, the last residential school was closed in 1996. In the films Muffins for Granny, We Were Children, and My Auntie Survived Residential School, I listened to the stories of survivors of residential schools. The stories were powerful, yet heartbreaking. I have learned the Indigenous narrative of storytelling is the method of which knowledge is transferred and shared and passed down from generation to generation. The survivors of residential schools are retelling, but also re-traumatizing themselves for settlers to learn the truth of residential schools. A part of the film, Muffins for Granny, speaks about the apology from the churches and federal government, and that the apology was specific to the sexual and physical abuse. The apology did not include the loss of language, culture, spirituality, and so on. I learned the residential school system disrupted the passing of information and storytelling. That is a big part of Indigenous culture. I learned that settler colonialism is not just something of the past, but still in the present. The number of Indigenous children in the care of Child Protective Services today is evident that little has changed since the closing of residential schools. We must go beyond making apologies and commit to act that honor the process of reconciliation. I find myself wrestling back and forth with my own faith because of the injustices that have been linked to the churches. I learned that the use of social media, podcasts, and the internet have been useful for Indigenous communities to help share information and resources for people to get involved. At the same time, taking into consideration that access to the internet is a privilege, and the Indigenous representation that you see online is not a full representation and reflects a portion of the Indigenous community. Despite the settler efforts in trying to assimilate Indigenous peoples are fighting to reclaim their land, language, culture, and things that they have been taken from them along the way. Indigenous peoples are still here, thriving, and their presence through art, telling stories through written, oral, and visual formats contribute in meaningful ways to Canadian society. It amazed me that given the colonizers and settlers' attempt to assimilate Indigenous peoples and watching the brave and resilient survivors of residential schools tell their stories, the colonizers were the unsuccessful ones. I am still educating myself and learning. Looking inward in myself and where I stand today, I think about the process of reconciliation and believe that we are stronger interconnected. There is a quote in Susan Dion's Braided Learning book that stood out to me. Education got us into this mess, and education will get us out of this mess. I continue to educate myself on the histories of Indigenous peoples, and I'm taking responsibility for my own learning. There is far more work ahead for me in learning, unlearning, and relearning the truths of Canadian history. 2 books on my list to read are 7 Fallen Feathers and a book called This Place to learn more about the deaths of Indigenous teens in Thunder Bay and to learn more about Indigenous futurism and engagement with history. We all have work to do in terms of allyship and to help repair what Indigenous peoples have lost. Thank you for giving me the space to share my journey in learning about residential schools.
Hello, my name is Marilee Molina, and I work at the Lassonde School of Engineering. I would like to start by sharing a little bit about my background. I am Latin American from El Salvador. I grew up as a Salvadorian refugee in Costa Rica prior to moving to Canada. I was part of a community that peacefully and actively voiced social inequalities and violations of human rights. My awareness about social justice is rooted in popular education, learning from grassroots advocates, elders, artists, and musicians. This experience helped me develop great sensitivity and curiosity to learn about Indigenous peoples and their peaceful resistance through spirituality and community building. As an immigrant, I feel grateful for the opportunity to inhabit these treaty lands. I am grateful to all the generations of Indigenous people who've taken care of this land for thousands of years and continue doing their work today. As a mother of 2, I feel great responsibility to raise children who are fully aware of the active cultural genocide of Indigenous peoples in Canada. I feel responsible to help my children develop empathy, respect, and genuinely appreciate and honor the worldviews of the various Indigenous communities. This is hard work. Life gets in the way, working full-time, studying part-time, having kids, and all kinds of extracurricular activities. I know parents in the room hear me when I say it's hard to find time. And it did take me some time to find ways to weave this work into the fiber of my family. However, I can say it's possible, and I'd like to share with you just a few practices that have worked for me. We have incorporated the land acknowledgement into all our holiday celebrations, especially Thanksgiving, Christmas, and Canada Day. We personalize the land acknowledgement as part of blessings before dinner. As part of this reflection, we acknowledge that all the national holidays are rooted in Canada's colonial policies and pray for the social justice of Indigenous peoples. We serve the main meal on one bowl with one spoon to pay tribute to the dish with one spoon that advocates for peaceful coexistence and resource sharing. As part of this practice, there are no knives on the table as a symbol of peace. The next one is very meaningful. Not that the first one isn't, but it's closer to my heart. As the Day of the Dead, or Día de los Muertos, is a holiday in many parts of Latin America, we learn to celebrate this holiday. In our altar, or shrine, and ofrendas, or offerings, we make room for a special item that represents the Indigenous children who did not make it back to their homes and families. We pray for the healing of their parents and all survivors. On this day, we practice a minute of silence or a silent walk to pay some respect for all the bodies and unmarked graves found in residential school properties. For an uplifting and more positive experience, we attend 1 or 2 powwows a year. Since 2016, I've been bringing my kids and family to the annual powwow held here at York. It's organized by York's Indigenous Student Association. It's beautiful to see the number of generations coming together in ceremony, from toddlers to elders, sharing song and dance. We've learned to pay respect to this tradition and feel very welcome. Also, we attend the annual Honor Walk for Every Child Matters, hosted by Toronto Indigenous Harm Reduction. It's by the lake, close to Ontario Place. I think their next event is next week. There is a water ceremony and drumming where each participant makes a small tobacco tie wrapped in orange fabric and placed in the water as offerings and blessings. It is through these practices that we remain connected and in solidarity with Indigenous peoples and their continued work to achieve justice. Our circle has expanded beyond my immediate family. My closest relatives and friends are now more aware and participate in our traditions, which of course brings me great satisfaction. And lastly, as an acknowledgement of this year's theme of engaging in reconciliation through various forms of film and media, I'd like to share that last year, as my kids turned ages 11 and 14, I decided it was time for us to watch the film Indian Horse. The movie is a painful story of the dark history of residential schools in Canada. Within this oppressive environment, the main character, named Saul, finds salvation in playing hockey. He self-teaches the sport and is allowed to leave the school to play for a professional league, where he's confronted with high levels of racism. Saul decides to fall back on spiritual practices and seeks his friends and community for healing. The movie allows us to have an open discussion about our own Catholic faith and the role of the church in the system of residential schools. We talked at great length about issues of power and abuse. It was also a great opportunity to unpack my kids' definitions of what entails a happy ending. Used to Disney's traditional movies, they had a hard time understanding that for Saul to return to family, friends, or community is a heroic act, and it speaks to the meaning of success that is grounded on Indigenous resilience. Of course, the film was not easy to watch. The conversation was painful. However, as many have quoted, Professor Dion mentioned in her 2021 live stream reflection on this celebration, ignorance protects you, but hurts others. It allows to avoid the implications in knowing what was done. Discomforting emotions are necessary in this process of accepting our responsibility to learn from Indigenous peoples' experiences and perspectives. I hope this reflection can help others find ways to incorporate this learning process in their lives. Thank you for your time, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Hello, everybody. I just want to acknowledge the wonderful reflections that my colleagues share, and I get the honor and privilege to be the last one to share with you today. So I was asked to also to think about my own learning journey in my own understanding of residential schools and what that means to me over the years and today. And first, I want to start a little bit about myself. So I share this because it is important to think about that in relationship to schooling. I am an immigrant settler, a Cantonese Chinese woman originally from Hong Kong, with mixed heritage on my paternal grandfather's side. My family's view of schooling was such that school was paramount, and part of it was not just the old trope that I think is the trope that Chinese people value schooling. It is because schooling was seen as an opportunity for social mobility. My grandmother was widowed very young with 2 mixed-race children, and for her, the only way forward, with especially in Hong Kong, the rumblings of the Cultural Revolution happening, was to make sure that she set a path forward for her children. And so that meant for my parents, on both sides actually, but particularly on my father's side, Catholic school education was really, really critical. And that I also, like others, was raised Catholic and came to Canada and pursued that. So, whether or not it was my original primary education in Hong Kong with the Maryknoll Sisters, or in high school, the Sisters of St. Joseph, Catholic education was part of that. And I was raised very much so in that tradition of thinking that school was everything. In fact, school was the place where you learned, you had to respect your teachers and all of that. So absolutely, for sure, I did not grow up with any understanding of residential schools. And it wasn't until 1989, when I was in university, actually, but not because of university, I was university age, that I first saw the film Where the Spirit Lives. And Where the Spirit Lives was a film in 1989 that starred Michelle St. John, an Indigenous actor, and also with Anne-Marie MacDonald, a great author in Canada that many of us love. And it was my first encounter with my sister about a film about children being taken into residential schools, and particularly ones run by the Catholic Church. It was my first encounter there that I saw this trauma, this trauma, this intergenerational trauma, the taking, as Susan noted, of language and culture. And that there were some elements there that were familiar to me. It's not to say that I didn't grow up also in a colonial and religious schooling system. It was very difficult coming in 1970s, in what is now Scarborough, but at that time, a very white Scarborough. It wasn't like there wasn't racial trauma or discrimination or, in fact, violence. But for me, there was a difference because there was a family home to go home to. So when we went home, we processed a lot of that stuff. We sat around the kitchen table, my parents, my aunt and uncle who had sponsored us, our grandmother who was raising us as grandchildren would talk about those things. My parents often talked openly about discrimination and challenges they were having in trying to find work. The challenges they faced in not speaking English the proper way, and the pressure that they put on myself and my cousins and my sibling in terms of learning English and making sure we didn't have a Chinese accent. But we processed all of that as a family. We had food to connect with, we had stories to tell, and we had our language to hang on to, even though my Chinese or my Cantonese is not nearly as good as it was before. So this stood out for me at that. I would have been probably 19, 20 at that time, seeing this movie. But honestly, I parked that away. I parked that film away because there wasn't Google. It stood out almost like an island of an experience of there was this one film where this story was told, but there was no other information. I did my undergraduate studies in English and psychology here at York. I was particularly in love with what was called post-colonial fiction. I read many authors from India, the Caribbean, and Africa, and African-American authors, but I never encountered stories by Indigenous authors. And so for many years, that film stood kind of almost as an island in a memory for me. It wasn't much until much, much later, in fact, decades later, that I, as the TRC was happening, probably in the late 2000s, that I encountered an art exhibit, probably on a business trip, I think, and it was the art exhibit 100 Years of Loss. It's an art exhibit put on by the Legacy of Hope Foundation, an Indigenous charitable organization. And that exhibit had many, many photos and artifacts. And it was those faces of Indigenous children sitting in those rows of schools, in school rows with their hair, cut, dressed in very Western attire, with the faces and the stern faces of the teachers, the nuns, the priests, that sense of forced assimilation. And that really was very, very hard to take. It moved me a great deal, and I experienced that show particularly, I kind of happened on it. It was, I think, in a city hall. So it was one of those things you came into and you didn't know that you were going to see this. And experiencing it alone was, I think, very significant as well, because it reminded me again back to that film that I saw. And then I want to also share a vignette of myself as a parent. My daughter, who also shares, I have two children, one of them particularly loves school, and she loved school very much, and she came home with a book that they were reading called Fatty Legs. And it was a book that was part of the TDSB curriculum, and I'm very glad these stories are part of the curriculum now. It was a reflection, a memoir of an Inuit child who was taken into residential school and shamed. And so it had the intersection of both her experience as an Indigenous person, but also her experience as a woman, because she was wearing tights and they would tease her and call her fatty legs. But again, it was also a story of overcoming and cultural pride and resilience. And so we had to work through that. And it was my daughter's own first encounter of that story. So in some ways, it reminded me, although she was much younger, of my own encounter seeing that film, Where the Spirit Lives. And I'm going to jump ahead now to a couple of years later after that, and actually in this building. So when I was asked by Amy to come and speak here today, I thought of this building specifically, because it was in this building that I met the very esteemed and amazing Justice Murray Sinclair. And it was in 2015 when he had finished up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission work. I could see he's a great man, both in accomplishments but also in size. But he was also a very tired man, and York was bestowing or giving him, honoring him with an honorary doctorate. And there was a small group of us, actually, that was part of the then Aboriginal Education Council here at York. And I was sitting as a non-Indigenous member on that council that had a chance to meet him. And I think we met him in the hallway. And it was a great moment for me, because it also, he was talking to us, and I really remarked by him, really, somebody next to me had asked, with the recommendations, what do we do? And his answer was simple, and it still stands out today to me. His answer was, do something, start somewhere. And that really resonated for me. And so, that's another important vignette. The last vignette I want to share with you is something that happened right before the pandemic. So some of you will know that I work here at York University now, but for about 5 years I was the executive director of the Ontario Council of Articulation and Transfer, which is a provincial agency that works then initially with college and the universities primarily, but over that time there, we also worked more closely with Indigenous institutes. And I often remind our post-secondary sector colleagues that there is a third pillar to Ontario's post-secondary system, and those are Indigenous institutes, and they do great work. And I was actually up, we didn't know the pandemic was going to shut things down, but I was actually up at Algoma University in what is now known as Sault Ste. Marie. And we were there doing an announcement and doing a couple of things. We were announcing the work that we had done with a number of northern colleges and universities to bridge Indigenous student recruitment and transfer credit recruitment and bring that work together. We were also announcing some work we were doing to make sure that Indigenous institutes would have full recognition on ONCAT's governing board, that they would also be able to, previously they could be part of grant applications, but they were never able to be part of lead grant applications. And I saw that as, quite honestly, wrong. So we were there working with the Indigenous Institute in that area. But it was also significant because Algoma University is very unique. It's actually the building that was a residential school. It was the Shinwalk residential school, and it has a very, very dark history that I will say that they acknowledge fully. And so for them, it's very important for them to take the work of reconciliation as part of that work. So being there as part of, as a professional, being there as a colleague working in the sector, being there and actually participating in a tour of the school, seeing the main building, seeing what is now the principal's house, that was the principal's house, now transformed into a cultural center, kind of an equivalent of KISS, seeing also the cemetery where children were buried, and they acknowledge that perhaps there are more that are buried that may not be in the cemetery, and seeing also the hall that Algoma University has set up with many of the artifacts and a history of their past and that story was really important for me. And having that done as part of my professional work was important, although difficult. And so I'll end now with thinking about what now. I mean, this is always a difficult question, and I want to say that, as others have said, this is ongoing and personal work. It's also true that I want to say that it's not just personal work. It's not good enough for me to attempt to do this work, but not to do that in solidarity with my other colleagues, because I often work with Susan and others, and many times I've made missteps. Many times I've had to relearn or take counsel from other colleagues. And sometimes the work is complicated because the nature of my role sometimes has rules and functions and responsibilities that hit up against power structures and systems and structures that make it a little bit more difficult. So it is hard to navigate, but I also want to acknowledge that it's not work that one can do alone. Even if a colleague, if I encounter a colleague who knows how to work respectfully with Indigenous students or Indigenous colleagues, but we are, in the end, a whole university, and if they encounter something different from another colleague, then I think it diminishes each one of our own work. So to me, this is both a personal process of learning, but I think more importantly, I want to challenge us to think about it as a collective, communal responsibility of learning and working with each other, and to build those good relationships and repair that. And so I'll end with that to say that that's my great hope, and my reflection for the day.
Wow. We have these ideas, about, let's do this panel again. Let's invite people to share. And I'm standing here feeling really overwhelmed by what I've heard from each of you today. And I'm grateful for your words. I'm struck by and deeply appreciate hearing this diversity of voices and the work and the effort and the seriousness with which you responded to our request. In your sharing, I think that you give me hope for the ways in which people are doing the work. Truth and reconciliation. What is reconciliation? What will it be? I don't think that we're there yet. But in the voices of each of you sharing the work that you're doing to get to the truth, I think that's what I'm really overwhelmed by, is how seriously people are taking up the work of getting to the truth. I heard so much that made me feel connected, right? I think that the reference to the elders and the importance that, and the gratitude to the work of the elders. People You mentioned the children and children in school today and what they learn and what they don't learn, and our responsibilities as educators to continue to work collectively, to work to transform what is being taught about Indigenous people's experiences and perspectives. You know, even like your song, Nancy, really brought spirit into this space of learning. And it followed so beautifully, Dirk, what you asked us to think about, you know, the body and emotion. And during different times during the talks, I was really reflecting on this, this idea that I've been thinking about, the thinking heart, about how our emotions and our thoughts are so connected. Our emotions make us think, or like Alice, like you said, sometimes not want to think, want to move away from. But so what we think and what we feel are connected. And I think that's the overwhelming message that I heard today, is that we need to do that hard work of engaging with these difficult stories, the difficult knowledge that is embedded in our stories. We need to pay attention to what our bodies are telling us about what we're feeling, by what we're learning, and how our learning is making us feel. Do we want to get close? Do we want to move away? How do we get to the truth? And I heard people talk about recognizing their implication, right? If we live on this land, we are in relationship with these stories, with this history. We're in relationship with Indigenous people, with the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape, the Potawatomi, the Mi'kmaq. We are in relationship with each other. And we need to remember that, right? In all of our actions, remember that my well-being is connected to your well-being. Your well-being is connected to my well-being. We're connected, all of us. And we're connected to the well-being of the land that we live on. So I know someone talked about that, the dish with one spoon. And we have to pay attention to who's around the dish, right? Who are we gathered around this dish? And how do we think about, well, what I take is going to impact what is available for the person next to me, right? It's about, that treaty is about our relationship with each other and the land. And I think that all of your talks were about relationship. I loved your stories about your family, and about, Marilee, what you're doing with your children and what you're asking and giving. And so I think that I want to just finish with this sense of appreciation. We put out a call, we invited people, and you stepped up, you stepped forward and shared your words and shared your learning. And I very much appreciate it, and I think all of us here and all of us online appreciate the responsibility that you accepted in speaking today. So I just also want to invite everyone to come to Skennen'kó at Gamiig. It's just down the hall and down the stair, out the door and down the stairs. We have a sacred fire in our teepee. You were given tobacco when you came in, tobacco ties. And the knowledge that's embedded in this practice, it is about our relationship and our relationship to each other in this world and our relationship to the spirit world. And so that that practice is about it's a cultural practice, right? And there's knowledge in that practice about how we also have to recognize our responsibility to the ancestors. And so 7 generations back and 7 generations forward. So you take that tobacco in your hand and you, with your mind and your heart and your body, you put your prayers, your thoughts, your petitions into that tobacco, and then you put the tobacco into the fire. And the fire takes your thoughts and feelings and emotions and hopes into the spirit world and to the Creator. So you're invited to join us at Skennen'kó Gamiig, and there will also be some refreshments there. And I also want to thank Compass and Auxiliary Services for supporting us today and providing the refreshments. So with that, I want to say Gwata Anashik, particularly, to Dirk, Nancy, Marilee, Angie, and Yvette for your words, and of course, for your land acknowledgement and your opening remarks, Alice, and ask everyone to join us at the Sacred Fire if you're able to. And with that, I'll just take a moment to give thanks and Chimigwich Anashik. Join us at the fire. Thank you.